April 19 for 5. Western Germany. Cold rain tapped against the canvas roof of an American field hospital pitched on the edge of a ruined town. Beyond the tents, military trucks churned through deep mud, while distant artillery rolled across the horizon. Like fading thunder, the war was entering its final weeks, but the flow of wounded men had not slowed. Inside one surgical tent, bright lamps cast sharp circles of light across metal instruments arranged in perfect rows. American medics moved quickly between operating tables as generators hummed outside. Near the entrance stood several German nurses. Hours earlier, they had expected capture, perhaps interrogation, perhaps imprisonment. Instead, an American surgeon glanced toward them, pointed to an operating table where a critically wounded soldier fought for life, and issued a simple instruction: they were needed. And in that moment, fear gave way to something none of them had anticipated. By the spring of 1945, the German Reich was unraveling on every front. In the east, the Soviet army was advancing toward Berlin through the ruins of cities and villages devastated by years of warfare. In the west, American, British, Canadian, and French forces had crossed the Rhine and were pushing deep into Germany itself. The front lines shifted almost daily. Roads became crowded with retreating soldiers, refugees, damaged vehicles, and endless columns of wounded men searching for treatment. Germany's medical system had spent nearly 6 years under the strain of total war. Now it was approaching collapse. Hospitals that had once served entire regions struggled to function after repeated bombing raids. Medical supplies grew scarce. Essential drugs disappeared from storage rooms. Surgical equipment wore out faster than it could be replaced. Ambulances lacked fuel. Railway networks that once carried casualties to larger hospitals were increasingly disrupted by Allied attacks. The wounded kept arriving. Military doctors faced impossible choices. Some hospitals operated far beyond their intended capacity. School buildings, churches, municipal halls, and private homes were converted into temporary treatment centers. Hallways filled with stretchers, basements became operating rooms. In many locations, electricity functioned only intermittently, forcing medical staff to work under dim lamps or candlelight. German nurses carried much of the burden. Many belonged to organizations such as the German Red Cross. Others served in military hospitals or emergency aid stations closer to the fighting. Long shifts became normal. Sleep became rare. They cleaned wounds, administered medicine, comforted dying patients, and assisted surgeons through endless operations as casualty numbers climbed. Yet exhaustion was only part of the crisis. Rumors traveled faster than official reports. News of advancing Allied armies spread through hospital wards. Nobody knew exactly what would happen when enemy troops arrived. For many nurses, uncertainty became as frightening as the war itself. The collapse of Germany's military position was no longer a distant possibility. It was approaching the doors of the hospitals where they worked. Yet the greatest shock for many nurses would arrive not when American troops entered their towns, but after the fighting had already passed. As Allied armies advanced across Germany in 1945, they brought with them something often overlooked in accounts of the war: an enormous medical network. Behind every combat division moving toward the front stood a carefully organized chain designed to keep wounded soldiers alive. The system had been refined through years of fighting in North Africa, Italy, France, and Belgium. By the time American forces entered Germany, military medicine had become one of the most sophisticated operations of the entire war. The process began near the battlefield. A wounded soldier first received emergency treatment from combat medics working under fire. From there, he might be transferred to an aid station, then to a clearing station, and eventually to a field hospital where surgeons could perform more complex procedures if he survived. Evacuation hospitals farther behind the lines could provide longer-term care before transport back to Britain or the United States. Speed was everything. Doctors understood that the first hours after a severe injury often determined whether a man lived or died. Blood plasma, antibiotic such as penicillin, improved surgical techniques, and better evacuation procedures dramatically increased survival rates compared with earlier conflicts. The American medical system also carried another responsibility. Under international agreements governing warfare, wounded enemy soldiers were entitled to medical treatment. German prisoners suffering from injuries could be admitted to Allied hospitals alongside American casualties. Medical personnel who were captured often occupied a unique position. Unlike ordinary prisoners, doctors and nurses possessed skills that remained urgently needed. As American units moved through Germany, they encountered hospitals still staffed by German surgeons, nurses, and support workers. Some facilities were taken over intact, others were integrated into occupation administration. In many cases, medical services could not simply stop because control of a town had changed hands. People were still wounded, operations still had to be performed, patients still required care. For German nurses, who had spent years treating their own country's soldiers, this created an extraordinary situation. The enemy they had been taught to fear now controlled the hospitals around them, yet instead of being dismissed, some found themselves standing beside American surgeons beneath operating lamps, participating in the same struggle against death. And it was inside those operating rooms that the human story truly began. For many German nurses in 1945, the arrival of Allied troops brought a deep sense of uncertainty. Throughout the war, propaganda had shaped expectations about what capture might mean. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, and official reports often portrayed enemy armies as ruthless forces that would seek revenge once they entered Germany. As the front collapsed and towns surrendered, rumors spread rapidly through hospitals and refugee colonies alike. Some nurses destroyed documents before Allied troops arrived. Others hid insignia or uniforms. Many simply waited. They had spent years caring for German soldiers. Some had served near combat zones. Others had worked in military hospitals treating casualties from every major campaign of the war. Few knew how American forces would view them when American units entered hospitals. However, the reality was often far less dramatic than the fears that had preceded it. Medical personnel were questioned, registered, and instructed to continue caring for patients. The wounded still filled beds. The need for treatment had not disappeared with the change of military control, yet fear did not vanish overnight. Every new order carried uncertainty. Every unfamiliar face reminded them that the war they had known was ending, and nowhere was that uncertainty more intense than inside an American surgical unit. The operating rooms of American field hospitals looked very different from the exhausted facilities many German nurses had recently known. Even in temporary canvas tents, organization was precise. Instruments were sterilized and arranged methodically. Surgical teams followed carefully rehearsed procedures. Nurses, anesthetists, surgeons, and assistants moved through their tasks with remarkable speed. Generators supplied electric lighting. Medical supplies arrived through a logistical system stretching hundreds of miles behind the front. The pace could be astonishing. Ambulances delivered casualties one after another. Surgeons sometimes performed multiple major operations in a single shift. Shrapnel wounds, gunshot injuries, fractures, burns, and abdominal trauma demanded immediate attention. For German nurses suddenly working alongside American staff, the experience could be overwhelming. Language barriers complicated communication. Different medical practices require quick adaptation, yet the basic language of medicine remained familiar. A surgeon requesting an instrument, a nurse monitoring a patient's condition, an assistant preparing bandages. These actions required little translation. The operating room became one of the few places where national identity mattered less than competence. Lives depended on cooperation. Perhaps the most striking experience for many German nurses was seeing wounded men from opposing armies treated under the same roof. Only days earlier, these soldiers had been trying to kill one another. Now they occupied neighboring beds. American doctors followed military medical policies that required treatment based on medical need rat. Her then nationality. A severely wounded German prisoner could receive surgery before a less critical American casualty if his condition demanded immediate intervention. For some German nurses, this challenged assumptions formed during years of total war. The operating table did not recognize uniforms. Blood loss looked the same regardless of rank or nationality. Pain sounded the same in every language. Inside the surgical tents, the purpose was not victory. It was survival. And as former enemies worked side by side to save lives, another dimension of the story began to emerge, one shaped not by fear, but by professional duty, discipline, and the people responsible for leading these extraordinary medical teams. The American surgeons leading these medical units had spent years operating in the shadow of war. Many had arrived in Europe after serving through campaigns in North Africa, Sicily, Italy, France, or Belgium. Others had trained extensively in military hospitals before deployment. By 1945, they had treated thousands of casualties and witnessed injuries on a scale few civilian doctors had ever encountered. Experience had shaped their priorities. Speed mattered, discipline mattered, but above all, survival mattered. When a wounded patient arrived at an operating table, surgeons rarely had time to consider nationality, politics, or personal history. Their attention narrowed to damaged organs, shattered bones, blood loss, infection, and the limited hours available to save a life. The pressure was relentless. Operations often continued deep into the night. Medical teams worked through exhaustion, surviving on brief periods of sleep between waves of casualties. During major offensives, dozens of wounded men could arrive within a single day. Under such conditions, every capable pair of hands became valuable. If German nurses possessed useful training, many surgeons saw practical reasons to use those skills. The war was still producing casualties. Patients still required treatment. Professional competence often outweighed old loyalties. In that environment, medicine became a shared mission. The German nurses brought years of experience of their own. Many had entered service long before the final collapse of the Reich. They had treated soldiers returning from Russia, North Africa, Italy, France, and the defense of Germany itself. They had learned to work through shortages, air raids, and overcrowded hospitals. By 1945, few illusions remained. They had witnessed amputations performed under difficult conditions. They had cared for burned victims pulled from bombed cities. They had comforted patients whose families would never know where they die. Those experiences made them valuable. American medical officers quickly recognized that trained nurses could not be replaced easily, even when language barriers existed. Technical knowledge often bridged the gap. A nurse who understood sterilization procedures, surgical preparation, patient monitoring, and emergency care could contribute immediately. At first, interactions were often cautious. Conversations remained brief. Trust developed slowly, but long hours inside operating rooms created familiarity. Medical staff observed one another's professionalism. Competence earned respect more effectively. In words, the enemy became less abstract when standing only a few feet away beneath the same surgical lights. Outside the hospitals, Germany was collapsing. Cities lay in ruins. Millions of civilians were displaced. Entire military formations were surrendering. Yet inside many medical facilities, a different reality existed. The operating room demanded focus on the individual rather than the nation. A patient struggling to breathe, a surgeon controlling bleeding, a nurse preparing instruments, a medic carrying fresh supplies. These small acts, repeated hour after hour while governments fell and armies advanced. Numerous post-war recollections from both Allied and German medical personnel describe moments of mutual respect emerging under these circumstances. The shared experience of caring for the wounded created connections that neither side had expected. Professional duty provided common ground at a time when almost everything else was divided. The transformation was rarely dramatic. It happened gradually. A successful operation, a word of thanks, a difficult case completed together, a life saved, and then, one day, The moment arrived when cooperation would be tested under the most demanding conditions possible during an emergency operation where hesitation could mean death. The moment many German nurses remembered most did not begin with a speech, the ceremony, or an official order. It began with an ambulance outside an American field hospital in Western Germany. Its engine growled as it pulled through the mud toward the receiving area. Medics jumped from the vehicle before it had fully stopped. A stretcher followed moments later. The patient was in critical condition, top blood soaked through layers of bandages already applied farther forward. His uniform was torn. Dirt and fragments of debris covered his clothing. Every minute mattered. Inside the surgical tent, the atmosphere changed instantly. Doctors, who had been reviewing charts, moved toward the operating area. Nurses prepared instruments. Orderlies cleared pathways between tables. The familiar routine of emergency medicine unfolded with practiced precision. But for the German nurses standing nearby, the situation carried a different weight. Only a short time earlier, they had viewed the Americans as enemies. Now they found themselves inside an American medical unit as a life hung in the balance. One of the surgeons assessed the casualty, thought the wound was severe, without immediate surgery. Survival was unlikely. There was no time to debate staffing arrangements or search for additional personnel. The hospital was busy. Casualties continued arriving. Every trained medical worker available could make a difference. The surgeon issued instructions. Some were directed toward American staff, others were directed toward the German nurses. For a brief moment, uncertainty filled the room. The nurses understood enough to recognize what was happening. They were not being asked merely to observe. They were being assigned responsibilities. One moved toward the instrument table. Another assisted with preparation around the operating area. Third helped organize supplies needed for the procedure. The hesitation lasted only seconds. Training took over. Years of medical experience replaced fear with routine action. Instruments were passed. Dressings were prepared. Sterile procedures were followed. The operating room settled into its familiar rhythm despite the unusual combination of personnel working within it. Outside, the war continued. American armored columns pushed deeper into Germany. Towns surrendered. Prisoners marched toward collection points. Entire sections of the front were collapsing. Inside the tent, none of that mattered. The world narrowed to a single patient. Bright surgical lamps illuminated the table. Anesthesia was administered. The first incision was made. And as the operation entered its most dangerous stage, the former enemies surrounding the patient realized that success or failure would depend on how well they worked together. As the operation progressed, the tent grew quieter. The sounds of the hospital beyond the canvas walls faded into the background. Conversations stopped. Boots moved softly across the floorboards. Every person surrounding the operating table focused on the same task. The patient's condition remained critical. Blood loss had already pushed his body close to its limits. The surgical team worked against time, attempting to control internal damage before shock became irreversible. Under the glare of the operating lamps, the surgeon moved steadily, making decisions measured in seconds. For the German nurses, the situation was unlike anything they had imagined. When Allied troops first appeared, there was no interrogation, no confrontation, no discussion of politics or ideology. The only concern inside the tent was whether the wounded man would survive. The next hour, instructions moved rapidly across the operating room. Some were spoken in English, others were understood through gestures and routine practice. Experienced nurses often knew what would be needed before the request was completed. Instruments appeared in waiting hands. Dressings were prepared. Equipment was adjusted. Every action helped maintain the rhythm essential to a successful operation. The patient began to stabilize, not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually. The dangerous bleeding that had threatened his life came under control. Vital signs improved. The tension that had gripped the surgical team eased slightly, though nobody relaxed completely. In wartime surgery, conditions could change without warning. Minutes stretched into hours. The operation continued. Outside, Darkness settled across the German countryside. Generators hummed steadily. Ambulances arrived and departed. More wounded men waited for treatment. Yet inside that single tent, a remarkable transformation was taking place. The nurses who had entered fearing their captors were no longer thinking about captivity. The surgeons who had once encountered German uniforms across battlefields no longer saw enemies standing beside them. They saw colleagues performing difficult work under extraordinary circumstances. Eventually, the most dangerous phase passed. The patient was still alive. His chances of survival remained uncertain, but he had been given something that seemed unlikely when he first arrived at the hospital. A chance. The operation concluded with the same discipline that had guided its beginning. Instruments were counted. Dressings were secured. The patient was prepared for postoperative care. Only then did the pressure begin to lift. There was no celebration. Medical personnel had little time for that. Another casualty might arrive at any moment. But something had changed. A barrier built by years of war had weakened inside that operating room, not through speeches or negotiations, but through shared responsibility and professional trust. And as Germany moved toward surrender, that experience would leave a lasting impression on many who had witnessed it, shaping memories that endured long after the guns fell silent. In the weeks that followed, scenes like this became increasingly common across occupied Germany. The war in Europe was approaching its end. American forces continued advancing through cities, towns, and rural districts, while German resistance weakened. On May 8, 1945, Germany formally surrendered, bringing the fighting in Europe to a close. The wounded, however, did not disappear. With the signing of surrender documents, hospitals remained crowded. Thousands of injured soldiers still required treatment, civilians wounded by bombing, artillery fire, and the chaos of the final months of the war continued. Arriving at medical facilities, disease, malnutrition, and displacement created new challenges that would persist long after combat ended. For this reason, many German medical personnel continued working. American occupation authorities quickly recognized that rebuilding healthcare services required experienced doctors, nurses, pharmacists, and hospital staff. Across numerous regions, German medical workers remained in their positions under Allied supervision. All hospitals resumed more stable operations. The transition was not always easy. Germany's infrastructure had suffered enormous damage. Medical supplies remained limited in many areas. Transportation networks needed repair. Entire communities lacked adequate healthcare facilities. Yet cooperation gradually became a practical necessity. American medical officers focused on restoring essential services. German nurses and doctors often found themselves treating civilians alongside former military patients. The work that had once centered on supporting a wartime army increasingly shifted toward caring for a shattered population trying to rebuild everyday life. For some nurses, the experience altered expectations formed during years of conflict. The Americans they encountered were not the figures described by wartime propaganda. Instead, many interactions revolved around administration, patient care, logistics, and recovery. Professional relationships developed in hospitals where former enemies now worked toward common goals. The operating rooms that had once served military emergencies became symbols of a broader transition. War had forced people into opposing camps. Medicine required them to work together, and as occupation replaced combat, many of those who had shared surgical tents and hospital wards began carrying away memories very different from the ones they had expected to have when the war first began. For many veterans of the Second World War, memories of the conflict were shaped by battles, retreats, bombardments, and loss. Yet among some medical personnel, different memories endured. They remembered operating rooms. They remembered hospital wards. They remembered moments when the boundaries separating friend and enemy became less important than the condition of the patient lying before them. In post-war accounts written by doctors, nurses, and medical officers from various nations, A recurring theme appears, again and again. Medical workers described the profession as existing somewhat apart from the wider conflict. They wore uniforms and served governments at war, but their daily responsibilities centered on preserving life rather than taking it. The final months of the war in Germany highlighted that reality. American medical units treated wounded German prisoners. German doctors continued caring for Allied casualties when circumstances required it. Hospitals that changed hands during the Allied advance often remained functional because medical personnel on both sides understood the consequences of interruption for German nurses who assisted Allied medical teams. These experiences often stood in sharp contrast to the fear they had felt when American forces first approached. The reality proved more complicated than the stories they had heard. The Americans were victors in a devastating war. The Germans were citizens of a defeated nation. Yet, inside hospitals, those identities frequently became secondary to professional responsibility. Years later, many participants remembered not political arguments or military victories, but individual patients. They remembered exhausted surgeons working through the night. They remembered nurses refusing to leave their posts despite fatigue. They remembered wounded men who survived against the odds and others who could not be saved despite every effort. These memories carried a lesson that extended beyond the war itself. The operating room demanded cooperation because human biology offered no alternative. Blood loss, infection, trauma, and pain ignored national borders. Every patient confronted the same vulnerabilities, and in confronting those realities together, former enemies sometimes discovered a measure of respect that battlefield encounters could never have produced. Those experiences would outlast the war, becoming part of a larger story about what survives when conflict finally ends. The Second World War is often remembered through images of armies, columns of tanks crossing borders, aircraft filling the sky, cities reduced to rubble, flags raised over conquered ground. Yet, some of the most revealing moments occurred far from the battlefield. Inside operating rooms, inside hospital wards. Inside tents illuminated by a single circle of light. In the spring of 1945, Germany was collapsing. Governments were falling. Front lines were disappearing. Millions of people were being swept into one of history's greatest upheavals. But beneath the glow of surgical lamps, another reality existed. A wounded patient needed help. A surgeon needed assistance. A nurse reached for an instrument. The task remained the same regardless of language, nationality, or uniform. The story of German nurses assisting American doctors is not a story about victory or defeat. It is a story about professional duty surviving amid destruction. It is a reminder that, even in a war defined by division, there were places where cooperation became unavoidable because human life depended upon it. The operating table offered no reward for hatred. It responded only to skill, discipline, and effort. When the war ended, cities would be rebuilt, borders would change, and armies would return home. But for those who stood together inside those surgical tents, one memory often remained. For a few critical hours, beneath the same bright light, former enemies stopped being enemies. They became caregivers fighting the same battle against death.